We have a format for John Adams Institute events which has the moderator introduce the guest, and I have made a vow that henceforth I would not step on the moderator's introduction. So I will say no more about Steve Coll and his book, except I will just point out that one of the things that pleases me most about books like his is the level of detail. And just to focus on one detail, the image of the young Osama bin Laden watching episodes of the TV show Bonanza with its black and white frontier justice and how appropriate that is both to his own worldview and that of his nemesis in the White House is just too wonderful for words. But I'll say no more. I'll just simply jump ahead and note that in terms of our upcoming programming, this Saturday, April 26th at 4 p.m., the John Adams will co-host a panel at the International Literature Festival in Amsterdam, which will mark the opening of the World Book Capital year. Amsterdam is the World Book Capital in 2008, featuring Junot Diaz, Ben Kachor, and the biographer Julie Phillips. At noon on that same day, Michael Martin will interview Junot Diaz, who incidentally just won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, at Boekhandel van Rossum on Beethovenstraat. The next day, Sunday, April 27th, we co-host an event at the Jewish Historical Museum featuring Ben Kachor, the only cartoonist ever to win a MacArthur Foundation so-called Genius Grant. We are very fortunate to have as our moderator this evening Joris Luijendijk. The geography of his educational experience ranges across a suitable span. He attended college in Kansas. He had Arabic and religious anthropology instruction in Amsterdam. He did graduate study in Egypt. His first book, translated as A Good Husband Sometimes Hits His Wife, followed the lives of his fellow students in Cairo. He has worked as a Middle East correspondent for De Volkskrant, Radio 1, NRC Handelsblad, and NOS Television. His recent books include A Corner of the Veil and the 2006 bestseller, which in the U.S. is translated as They Seem Almost Human. He was the presenter of the TV program Zomergasten for 2 years, and he lives in Amsterdam. And I will introduce now Joris Luijendijk.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much. Usually I tell the audience something like, thank you for coming, but in this case I should just tell you congratulations upon getting hold of a ticket. Because it's not every day that we have someone as prominent as Steve Coll. I don't know how many of you read Ghost Wars, but that pretty much will do away with your last bits of hope that they know what's going on. One of the vows I make as a moderator is not to step on the feet of the lecturer. So I asked Steve, does the audience need to know anything in particular about your biography to understand what you're about to tell them? And he said, no. And then said, so how long are you going to talk? And he said, doesn't matter. I have a speech for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. In the end, we bargained, and we gave him 25 minutes. Steve Coll, the Pulitzer Prize winner, has written a fantastic new book, Bin Ladens, puncturing myths, indeed supplying us with marvelous details that does away with any sort of easy stereotypical ideas of that region. And I'm now proudly and gladly passing on the word to you, Mr. Coll.
Thank you. It's a lot easier for me to stand and keep track of my watch, to keep my 25-minute pledge. Thank you all very much for coming out this evening, and I look forward to sitting back down and carrying on this conversation after I introduce it here. But I thought it would be useful for me to give you a sense of what my intention in taking on this subject was, and perhaps to give you a brief flavor of the narrative itself. It's a large story because it's a large family, and it covers a long period of time, but I think I can at least give you an outline of what the narrative arc feels like. I used to read, as a young journalist coming out of school, I used to read books in America that had titles like The Rockefellers or the Kennedys, and they were these multi-generational family historical narratives that were intended to tell you something about the span of political or economic history that a particular family helped to shape. And after working on Ghost Wars and thinking about the problem of writing about Saudi Arabia for a Western audience, it occurred to me one day in California, of all places, that there was a book called The Bin Ladens that might offer at least a gateway to such an attempt. My hope was to write in a specific way about Saudi Arabia and to try to break down some of the cliches that imprison American eyesight on the kingdom from the days of the oil shock and high gas prices and the newspaper cartoons of the greedy oil sheikh pouring his oil can into American cars, right through 9/11. There's been a sort of a mutual inability of these two countries, despite the close partnership of their governments, to see one another whole. And I thought that some of the complexity of the bin Laden family might provide a way to make that a little bit specific. I also wanted to write outside of Saudi Arabia a narrative of globalization, because the bin Ladens really are only a Saudi family to some extent. They are an immigrant family and very self-conscious of their origins, not just in Yemen, but in the diaspora of the Hadramaut that's done so much to shape the Islamic world over the last millennium. And then finally, I wanted to try to reinterpret Osama a little bit. I've worked on the subject of Osama bin Laden since the early 1990s, and in Ghost Wars, I felt that I had tried to describe him in the context of international radical Islamist movements, particularly after 1979, and also in the context of the Afghan war, but that I had, despite many trips to Saudi Arabia, found it difficult to get past the surface of the kingdom in my own reporting. It's a very difficult place to work, the hardest I've ever tried to work, because it doesn't have the points of entry that you're accustomed to as a journalist, a vigorous free press or political opposition or a tradition of free discourse. And so that made the challenge all the more sort of enticing in some ways. So that's the framework of at least ambition that brought me to this subject matter. And as I say, it would be impossible to give you a full flavor of what the narrative describes, but I thought I would try to give you an outline through an account of three of the principal characters in the narrative and the thread that seems to run through their personalities and experiences. First, Osama's father, Muhammad, who created the family fortune. Then his eldest brother, Salam, who ran the family for 20 years and particularly ran the family during the time that Osama became radicalized in the run-up to his founding of al-Qaeda. And then finally, I'll end with some reflections on Osama himself as a bin Laden. What does he take from his family, and what insight, if any, does the context of his family actually provide us about him? So I would say, to begin, that there is, in my sense of the record and all of this research, a sort of strain of charismatic genius that runs from the father through the eldest son and reaches Osama. And each time this strain of genius is passed down the generation to his eldest son and then to Osama, it's sort of refracted and distorted, or at least reinterpreted, and it reaches Osama in perhaps the most distorted form, at least from a Western perception. That certainly wouldn't be the view of his followers. But Mohammed bin Laden was a remarkable man by any measure. He was essentially orphaned in a famine-stricken canyon in southern Yemen and lost an eye as a boy working on a job site in Ethiopia, returned to his homeland, saw his father die, and at about age 14 walked out of this canyon 100 miles to the sea with his younger brother. buoyed to some extent by his membership in a diaspora, a very self-conscious Hadrami diaspora that took care of its own, but nonetheless very much on his own in a condition of some hardship. He boarded a ship, sailed around the Red Sea, and landed in Jeddah as a teenager just in time for the Great Depression. Between his arrival in about 1930 and the end of the Second World War, he hustled for a living. He started out sleeping in the sand, taught himself to be a bricklayer, a small-time contractor, learned to organize small repair and construction jobs. And he was then poised when the disruptions to international shipping and the Hajj pilgrimage finally ended at the end of the Second World War. He was in a position to build this great fortune. He did it through primarily a gift for intuition, and intuition about people. And his ability to not just ingratiate himself with the Saudi royal family, from whom all favor flowed in those days, even more than now, and it's still true to a considerable degree, but also he had an intuition about how to organize labor in a very difficult environment where there was no natural workforce, and conditions surrounding construction projects of the sort that he began to bid on were extraordinarily difficult. There were no roads in the country. There wasn't a single university. There was very little electricity to speak of. There was very little water treatment facilities. And yet he was able to bring together these large work camps of diverse laborers and throw them at jobs. And despite not having any formal education, he had an intuition about very complex engineering problems that served him well as he kind of swarmed job after job. But primarily his gift was his ability to make himself indispensable to the Saudi royal family. This was in the phase of sudden wealth in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, when the Saudi royal family behaved like winners of a grand lottery. They had an enormous windfall, and they spent it on themselves initially. And they did this mainly by building palaces in which they hoped to replicate some imagining of Western luxury, an imagining that had been often made available to them by Western oil companies that wanted them to become partners with the United States, would take them on these luxury shopping trips to the United States and essentially communicate to the princes, this is how a grand man lives. Well, they went after this with some gusto. They invited in international construction companies initially to start building roads and infrastructure around their palaces, but these companies, like the American giant Bechtel and others, became quickly frustrated with the way business was done in Saudi Arabia, because essentially you would start to do something sensible like build a road between Jeddah and Mecca, and you'd bring in equipment and get working, and on the third week of the job the telephone would ring and it would be Prince so-and-so down the way, and he would say, my refrigerator is broken. Can you send a man over to repair it? And someone would come over from Bechtel and try to fix the refrigerator, and the next day the phone would ring and they would say, that grader you're using on the road, I'd like to dig a garden with it or a swimming pool for my cousin. And payments were slow to come, and the requests piled up. They had to do with travel. My cousin needs to see a doctor in Paris. Can you please arrange that? And gradually, companies like Bechtel and others from Germany and Britain concluded by the early 1950s, life is too short. This isn't worth it. There are other places where we can make money in a considerable and more orderly way. And each time that these companies decided to pull out of a contract, there was Osama bin Laden ready to say, Your Highness, I'll get the job done just the way you like it. And he was able to adapt to the idiosyncrasies of the royal family from the very beginning. If they needed to barter chicken farms for a job because they were short on cash, he was willing to make that deal. If they wanted to borrow his equipment to dig swimming pools for 6.5 months while the city festered, that was fine with him. If they needed help facilitating travel to the West, or they needed something special imported from New York, he had an agent on Broadway and was ready to do the job. So he built this relationship as really the ultimate manager of the needs of his superiors, and then also the community of diverse laborers and engineers that he needed to organize to swarm these jobs and get them done. And the archives that I had the joy of digging through and discovering all of this in the United States, in Europe, to some extent in Saudi Arabia, are just full of this sense of him rushing into the gap that the West was leaving behind because it simply couldn't figure out how to do business in Saudi Arabia. As he succeeded, he was endowed with the prestige of being the sole contractor and renovator of the three holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and for 10 years Jerusalem, where he owned a house and was a property owner at the time of the 67 war. In fact, the bin Ladens, in at least a technical or legal sense, have a connection to the Palestinian claim of return. He was given these contracts. We found the bid documents and correspondence by the Hashemite, a committee led by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, but supported also with Saudi funding. And as he became a big man, he was inspired by the example of the Saudi royal family, and he decided that he would live the way a great sheikh in Arabia at that time did, which was to interpret the laws of Islam to allow him to take not just 4 wives, but as many in serial as he could accommodate. And so he organized 2 senior wives, essentially, who stayed married to him for a long while and had a reasonably normal sort of family on his compound, each of them. And then he had 2 positions that he seemed to move in and out of every year or two. Ultimately, he married 23 times and fathered 54 children. These children were born between about 1943 and his death in 1967. And as a father, he attended mainly to his sons and did not attend mainly to his daughters. But Osama was typical of the unions and the children born from this serial marriage and divorce pattern in Muhammad's life. There had been some previous suggestion that Osama was an outcast, that his mother was a slave, that he had a complex about his sort of unique sort of marginal status in the family. I don't believe that's true at all. He was a fully enfranchised son. When Muhammad divorced one of these shorter-term wives, he fully enfranchised any children they had as his legal heirs under Islamic law, and he arranged, as in the case of Osama's mother, for her remarriage to an executive in his own company who had a steady salary. Now, in fact, Osama's mother was a child, really, when she was presented in marriage to Osama bin Laden in Syria, where he was traveling as a businessman. She was perhaps 15 years old. He was perhaps 3 times her age, or maybe a little older. And the circumstances in which her very poor, relatively secular Syrian family handed her over in marriage to this traveling businessman are murky, but they seem clearly to have been transactional to some extent, at least in the sense that they would have expected employment for her brothers in his construction companies, which was a typical pattern of business-oriented marriage in which he engaged. So you can imagine she travels off with him, leaves her family at this age, becomes pregnant, gives birth to a son, and then within a short time is divorced by him and sent as a teenager with her only child, far from her family, into a new household with the man that Muhammad has arranged for her to marry. And it was in this household, with his stepfather and his then stepbrothers and sisters, that Osama grew up in a relatively familiar suburban nuclear household, but one in which he was the golden child, because it was through his legitimacy as Muhammad's enfranchised heir that the family enjoyed allowances and dividends of $200,000 or $300,000 a year and a share in the fortune that was steadily accumulating around them. In September of 1967, when Osama was about 10, his father was flying one of his jets, or actually it was a 2-engine propeller aircraft, to a work site down near the Yemen border. And one of Muhammad's characteristics was that although he was illiterate, never acquired any language but Arabic, and did not travel very far outside the Arab world, he was nonetheless a modernizer, and he had a vision for his sons that they should be citizens of the global age that he could see accumulating around him in Saudi Arabia. He was the first private Saudi to acquire an airplane. He sent his children to Quaker boarding schools in London, sons in particular. He sent his eldest son, Salam, to boarding school in England to prepare him for leadership in an English medium world. And even Osama, who went briefly to the Quaker school and came home in circumstances that aren't entirely clear, he enrolled in the finest prep school in Jeddah, where he assembled with boys in blue blazers and gray flannel slacks each morning at morning assembly, was taught by Irish and English teachers as well as Syrian and Egyptian ones. So Muhammad was flying this plane down to a job site in September of 1967, and he was attempting to land with his American pilot fresh out of the U.S. Navy on a makeshift airstrip that was a slope on a desert hill. And the pilot approached this strip marked by rocks and hovered above it about 300 feet, and a crosswind blew, and he made some miscalculations about thrust and attempted to go around and stalled and fell to the earth, and he and Muhammad died in a fire instantly in September 1967. Now, at this moment, the eldest of his children, Salam, the eldest of his sons, because his eldest child was a daughter, his eldest son, Salam, was no more than 21 or 22. And the company was engaged in massive infrastructure construction projects all around Saudi Arabia, including very sensitive defense projects on the Yemen border. Salam, at this time in England, was best known among his classmates at boarding school for his membership in a rock and roll band called the Echoes. One of his guitarists went on to marry the country singer Emmylou Harris. They played Beatles songs. He had a little red sports car that he parked outside the school grounds, in which he and his friends would sneak into London in. He smoked a pipe, tobacco pipe, because it was what you did to look cool in those days. And he's a very difficult man to describe, but I'm going to try to give you a flavor of the way he lived as he came of age. He returned to Saudi Arabia in blue jeans and T-shirts and donned the traditional robes of his father in order to take over the family, but he lived in a way that his father could barely have imagined. He began to acquire jets and became quite an accomplished and talented pilot, and never surrendered his passion for music and for rock in particular. He surrounded himself with musicians who were also pilots. Any pilot who could play the drums was welcome in his world. Any pilot who could play the guitar was welcome in his world. And he developed a repertoire that he performed informally in a nonstop global jet set tour, in which at any nightclub, right now, if he were here, he would come up and insist on taking the microphone, and he would lead all of you in House of the Rising Sun. Or he also preferred sort of corny American folk songs like On Top of Old Smoky and When She's Coming Round the Corner, When She's Coming Round the Mountain, Then She Comes. He also would go in Germany in the fall. He'd show up at Oktoberfest, and he would whip out his roll of $100 bills and pay his way onto the stage in order to sing German folk songs that he had memorized only on the flight over from Cairo a day before. And he had a particular gift for singing House of the Rising Sun in 7 languages, and he did this at an Academy Awards party in Los Angeles, where he paid his way onto the stage and asked the band to support him. And he also did it at the wedding of Anwar Sadat's daughter. He was apparently more enthusiastic than talented, but he knew no embarrassment and would perform in front of any audience at any time. And he also played the harmonica. Often while flying, he would call up air traffic controllers and play them their national anthem on the harmonica. He lived on the telephone. He was a migrant, and to an American, he's a very he seems inflected with American characteristics, because he's very mobile. He's always moving around. He has a great sense of play, but also very much interested in business. And he also was a very egalitarian person. Very Bedouin in this respect, I suppose, not just an American characteristic, but a great emphasis on everyone at the same table. And he used his disarming personality to level the playing field in business, because he had to do business with the CEOs of Fortune 500 and 1,000 corporations, Volvo and General Electric and dozens of other familiar names. And these were older men with great experience in business, and Salem used his personality to essentially level the negotiation. For instance, he would only hold negotiations while lying in bed, and he would make people come to his bedroom either in the hotel or at his home. And he would, for instance, when the CEO of Bell Canada came to Saudi Arabia to conclude the largest telecommunications deal in Bell Canada's history outside of Canada, he had the guy come to his house and forced him to lead a third of the group that he had assembled in several rounds of Frère Jacques, with the Canadians singing the French part. And by the time you got through these kinds of rhythms with Salem, when he turned to talk about the deal terms, you were sort of off balance, I think, was part of his method. But in any event, he had this kind of very sort of no errors. He preferred, he didn't like Palm Beach, Florida, for instance. He preferred the western small town of Panama City, which any of you Americans here know is properly referred to and proudly referred to as the redneck Riviera. That was where he was comfortable in blue jeans and with his kind of pilot rock musicians. And once he was at dinner with the CEO of a big company, and wine was served, and Salem drank a little bit lightly, but not generally to excess. And the wine was served, and the CEO tasted it and made a great show of sending it back, very dissatisfied with the waiter for having brought such a poor bottle to the table. And Salem got up and excused himself as if he was going to the men's room, and he went into the kitchen and he took out $200, and he got the waiter and he said, "Okay, give me the bottle that he just turned back, and give me this other bottle that you're about to serve." Takes the bottle that he's about to serve, pours it out, pours the other bottle into it, recorks it, has him go back out, pretend to open it, pour it again, and the CEO makes a great show of accepting it, and with great pleasure, and Salem kind of cuts him off from their business dealings right then and there. So the remarkable thing about him was that as he was living this life, he was also collaborating with Osama. And he traveled frequently to Pakistan to support his government's policy there, which Osama represented in a fully authorized way. And I've always been curious, as someone who's written about Osama for a long time and tried to understand exactly what his experience of life has been like, what Americans he ever met, apart from the journalists that he later invited in for interviews in the late 90s. And for instance, there's no evidence that he ever directly met with CIA officers. He was supported indirectly by CIA money, and the distinction probably doesn't matter very much. But there's no record, and he insists that he never met anyone formally in that way. So I'd always wondered, well, who did he meet? Well, Salem had this rolling entourage that included hot air balloon specialists and specialists in ultralight recreational aircraft. And one time he brought them to Pakistan to support some Saudi princes who were going to go hunting there. The Pakistani army said, "We're not really going to permit hot air balloons. They might start a war with India." But in any event, they went out into the desert. And one day, Salem said to his rock and roll guitar playing pilot friend George Harrington, "Oh, we got to go see my brother Osama." So they got into Salem's private plane and they flew up to the Afghan frontier and landed on a road. And Salem, this was 1984, was wandering around with a video camera the size of a big brick, one of those early video cameras, taking pictures of Osama's activities and developing a fundraising video. This is 20 years before YouTube. And so there was this way in which Salem brought the world and all of its technology, along with these chain-smoking, shaggy-haired, sort of hippie friends of his, to Osama's doorstep. And these were the Americans that Osama knew. He treated them with great respect. Any friend of Salem was a friend of his. And so finally there was a deal in 1986 where Osama wanted some of these shoulder-fired missiles that the Americans were handing out, but he wasn't getting them. And Salem arranged to organize a meeting with German arms dealers in a luxury hotel in London in 1986, and he invited Osama to the meeting, and he brought in all of his friends from the rock and roll traveling show because they had connected him with the arms dealer, and they were in a two-room suite, and Osama was in his room, and Salem was getting ready to go into the meeting. He sends to his friends, "Okay, look, my brother, he's really, really religious, so no jokes, and put your cigarettes out, and treat me like a sheikh, treat me with respect, as if I'm a big man, and we'll be out of here in 45 minutes. And that was essentially the way they collaborated. But it does suggest something that we can return to maybe later in conversation or with your questions, the extent to which Osama himself was a very orthodox figure, a fully authorized representative of his family, and someone able to collaborate with his brother Salam, who was running the family without any question about his authority, but was living a life that was really quite remarkably different than Osama's. So let me just finish very briefly by talking about Osama, and particularly to address the question, in what way is Osama a bin Laden, or what about his being a bin Laden provides a new way of seeing him as a leader of al-Qaeda, as a radical. And I think there are four things that I came to conclude about that question through the research. First is his extraordinary ability to lead diversity, a diversity unified by the imagined community of Islam, historical Islam. His father was very rare in this respect, and Osama is rarer still as a Saudi, as an Arab, as an Islamist, as even a terrorist of any kind, including secular leftists in Europe in an earlier era. The ability to gather a very broadly based following is quite unusual, and in Osama's case, he's managed to attract not just Saudis and Egyptians and Lebanese and Palestinians and Libyans and Algerians. He's managed also to attract Filipinos and Bangladeshis and Pakistanis and Indians and Afghans and also Africans and of all kinds, and Europeans, and even the odd American or two. And this sense of how to lead without discriminating on the basis of language or national origin or race is something that I see very much inspired by his father's example. His father organized such diversity right in the heart of Mecca, where all of the diversity of global Islam gathers annually. In this case, gathered in the bin Laden tent, literally walked by it, filed by it. But his father was able to take that diversity and make it his own, to organize it, to use it to bring labor together, to bring Italian engineers and American accountants and Somali bricklayers all into the same company, and to hold them together, because his company was filled with loyal, long-time employees. The second aspect of Osama's bin Ladenness that I think is important is his adaptation of the technologies of globalization. He's an innovator with technologies that cross borders, satellite telephones and aviation being two prominent examples, but also media. He anticipated the satellite television age in the Arab world and began to control it long before it really arrived for Arab politics. And I think this is inseparable from his relationship with his brothers and the gadget-collecting, pilot, border-smashing life that his brother Salam lived and brought to him, literally, on the frontier. He's also a businessman, an innovator and marketer. I mean, and what is Osama, after all, but someone who's built a brand? He went to business school. He served as a junior executive in his family's company. He was involved in sales strategies and other kinds of marketing problems. And this clearly has been part of his intuition about how to create and build al-Qaeda. And finally, I think of him now more than ever as a performer. There is this way in which he's quite subdued and quiet, and he modulates his voice in a very sort of an attempt to create certain effects in Arabic, but he loves the camera. And there's this great scene at his son's wedding in 2001 where he's invited the Taliban and some of his family members to Afghanistan for his son's wedding. And, of course, like any father, he wants a video of the wedding, but the Taliban ban all cameras. So he invites a friend from Al Jazeera and basically tells him to smuggle the camera in under his robe and shoot the wedding surreptitiously. And at one point, so the Taliban won't see him, and at one point he stands up and he delivers a poem, actually celebrating his murderous attack on the USS Cole, but he delivers this poem, and the his friend is filming it, and he comes down off the stage and pretending to the Taliban as if nothing is going on. He has his friend come into a shed, closes the door, says, "Can I see in the finder? How did I do?" And he looks at his performance, and he says, "That wasn't very good. I'm going to do it again." And he goes out and he films it a second time. So now you see him, as in this recent video, sitting before the camera with his gold robe and his now very dyed beard to cover up the gray that was visible a year or two ago to his audience. And I look at him now and listen to him, and I think of nothing other than solemn singing House of the Rising Sun in 7 languages. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. For those of you who haven't had the chance to read the book, you must now be as baffled as I was as I went through the book and these insane details that you have. I was expecting you to tell the hemorrhoid story.
Yes. Well, shall I? Now, Salam decided to film his hemorrhoid surgery at Columbia Presbyterian, or have it photographed into a montage. And he was very sort of, there was a bit of, it seems, hypochondria in his attitude towards the surgery, because he hired the finest cardiovascular surgeon in New York to do routine hemorrhoid surgery, and then insisted that he be permitted to bring in Polaroid cameras and photographed it, and then turned it into a slideshow, all seen from the point of view of his behind. And he actually presented this show to King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. And I can only tell you that in the course of doing this reporting, interviews in so many different places, so many people connected to one version of the family or another, everybody wanted to tell me about the hemorrhoid story. As soon as I couldn't even finish knocking on the door. Oh, I got to tell you about that. Did you hear about the hemorrhoid story?
It's just too, and together with the fact that his son at some point breaks with his father, returns to Egypt, and then 6 years later, when he's in his mid-20s, he marries a 52-year-old British grandmother.
Yes, his son Omar. Well, he's still in the headlines, I think, offering himself as a mediator between Osama and the rest of the world. I'm not sure that's going to work out, but
it's just, if someone would make something up like this, any editor would strike it out.
Yes.
It's just your reputation that saved you. I think that the impact a book makes on public opinion, a book like this, is twofold, isn't it? On the one hand, it's people buying the book, but it's also you giving a ridiculous number of interviews to all sorts of media, and of course it's a soundbite culture. So if you would say 3 or 4 general ideas that you'd like to introduce in public opinion with this book, what would these 3 or 4 be?
Well, I think the first is just to try to describe some of the true diversity within the generation of not just Saudis, but many other middle class and upper middle class and very privileged Gulf Arabs who came of age after the oil shock era of the 1970s. These were privileged people who had the money to purchase any identity they wished, and the way they struggled and chose to handle that opportunity is recognizable once you describe it in all of its complexity as a very, familiar problem of identity in a global age. And the sheer diversity and the specificity of that narrative within the generation of 54 to which Osama belonged, I think, at least for American readers who, as I said before, are somewhat imprisoned by their cliched understanding of Saudi Arabia, perhaps it's a way to unlock some of the specificity and humanity of Saudi Arabia.
So it's not monolithic.
It's not monolithic, yeah. And then the second is maybe to do with Osama himself. I mean, I think it's important to, and again, this is someone who spends most of his time in America, knows that this is a particularly American perception since 9/11, is to pull him out of his cave and to stop thinking of him as a backward-looking rejectionist, but to understand that he is a modern character, and he's very much specifically a product of modernity. Of course, he has backward-looking ideas and some radically sort of fundamental interpretations, even millenarian apocalyptic interpretations of Islamic texts. But his talent, his appeal, his achievements are all located in the here and now, not in this reaction. And so I think there's a way in which by doing the convenient cartoon of putting him in a cave with a beard that's down at his toes, you deprive yourself of a chance to understand why anyone ever follows him.
That's right. We'll come back to that later. So, two other myths I picked up which surprised me. One is that Israel was a galvanizing effect on him.
Well, he certainly has a legitimate claim to the issue, and that is something that has been often doubted in the past, because he was seen as talking about Palestine when he did, opportunistically, of course, as many Arab governments do. And in his case, people struggled to understand, well, what claim. It was understood that his father had occasionally worked in Jerusalem, but the extent of his involvement there over 6 or 7 years, and the fact that he owned property there, probably took 1 or 2 Palestinian wives. I really couldn't document that to my own satisfaction, but it seems likely. It provides a direct family connection. And Osama has occasionally talked about this, and everything he has said I now understand to be accurate. So he has recalled this aspect of his father's life, although only in outline form. He's recalled it accurately.
That's right. So if to bring this all together, it's not monolithic. That would be your insert. Israel was galvanizing. He was never a CIA agent. At least there are no proofs for this. He was an enfranchised son in the sense that he was an integral part of the family up until much longer than the family later on led on us to believe. And his wealth.
Yes, his wealth was much smaller than at least American intelligence services were reporting to 2 presidents before and after 9/11. At that time, both President Clinton and then President Bush were being told that Osama had $300 million. And the importance of this was that it implied that he could self-finance all of the activity that was visible. In fact, his allowances ran in the $200,000 to $300,000 a year. He may have had salaries of similar amounts, tax-free. This is in the early 1970s. And he did have an inheritance of perhaps between $10 and $20 million, but that was the extent of his wealth. And one of the remarkable reporting moments was most of what I could find out about the family's detailed finances, it turned out, was lying in open court records in American courthouses. As you know, in the American system, everything is pretty much open, civil suits and so forth. And I was down in the deep basement of the Los Angeles County Superior Court in the microfilm archives looking at an old divorce case involving one of Osama's brothers. And it turned out that this brother's ex-wife had doubted what she was being told about her husband's income. And so with court approval, she'd hired a forensic accountant and sent the accountant to Saudi Arabia to come back with a report about how all the bin Laden money worked. And this had happened in 1991, and this accountant had gone and come back with what I now understand to be an entirely accurate report about the family's wealth and allowance system and the parts that were principal and the parts that were dividends. And it was sitting there all this time in an open courthouse and never looked at by anybody in the system, the FBI or the intelligence community. And so as a taxpayer, I found that kind of frustrating.
But as a reporter?
As a reporter, it was pretty easy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I'm there, dude.
Exactly.
Yeah, so the absurdity of this is one more example of this best-paid, universally feared CIA that just forgets to look in an open divorce file court. All these things together, at some point, did you still think that you were writing about the real world?
Yeah, I mean, there was a way, though, in which this pattern of touching on the fantastic, even in the secular wing of the more westernized, secular might be too strong a word, but the more westernized wing of the family, it seemed of a piece, because there was this sense of no limits combined with ambition and self-invention that was present in the way some members of the family lived besides Osama. And then, of course, he takes that in his own direction.
That's right. You could perhaps say that Salem radicalized, but in our lifestyle.
Yes, exactly. And the way that those, I struggled for a while because I never want to go too far beyond where the evidence leaves off. I'm willing to interpret, but on the basis of an argument where I can cite particular evidence and not to speculate. Even though I think speculation is entirely valid about these things. But I was frustrated for a while because I wasn't sure how to connect Salem's radicalization with Osama's radicalization. But then through the interviewing, slowly, I got into the rock and roll secret entourage, and they started talking to me and passing me one person to the next. And I had been in particular told about this character, George Harrington, who was this salesman of ultralight aircrafts in San Antonio, Texas, and a rock guitarist, who I had been told had visited Osama with Salem. And we had a fairly common name, so finding him was, hard detective work. But eventually I had an address in Houston that I thought was probably his. Now, this is 25 years later, too, so he was a young man at the time. And so I go to the address at 9 in the morning, and I knock on the door. And his wife answers it, and I do that thing that reporters do. I'm here, I'm working on a book about the bin Laden family and so forth. I may have the wrong address, but I'd be... And she goes, "George, someone's here about the bin Ladens." and he comes to the door, and I explain the same thing again, and he looks at me and he says, "I've been waiting 6 years for you to turn up." And I'm not even sure he believed that I was a reporter, but he took me into his breakfast table and gave me the whole narrative, and it was quite wonderful. So eventually, Osama and Salem came together because it turned out that, in fact, they were collaborators. And there had been vague statements by Osama's mother and others that he really respected Salem, that the loss of Salem was a big event in his life, because I'm not sure I told you that Salem died in an aircraft accident in 1988 in San Antonio, Texas. So yes, this is the pattern of airplane disasters involving Americans that repeats in Osama's life, 20 years after his own father's death.
I think it's really beautiful the way you structure in the book all these mirror effects, indeed, with 2 deaths by airplane. And also that, for example, Mohammed bin Laden and Osama bin Laden both marry a 15-year-old girl. And these organizational skills you talked about. Could you make another mirror effect, perhaps between Arafat and Osama bin Laden?
Yeah, you probably know more about Arafat's biography than I do, but my impression also of his pattern of radicalization was that he came out to the West as a young activist, didn't he, to sort of argue his case at various times. And he probably had a similar pattern at the same time that, I guess he's a generation older than Osama, really.
And what I meant too is that he managed to turn basically defeats into public relations victories.
Yes.
And so the amazing, because I still had this idea in the back of my mind that Osama bin Laden had actually achieved something in Afghanistan. But now it turns out that this was just another PR gimmick.
Yes. Well, that's certainly true. I mean, it's bin Laden's generation of Islamists learned directly from the secular PLO about terrorism in the television age, terrorism as theater, terrorism as event, terrorism as media narrative. And the Palestinians really invented that genre of the global media era. But Osama was rare among the Islamists in his enthusiastic, talented embrace of that model, because much of the rest of his sort of peer group were engaged in debates about where technology fit in their idea of return to the 7th century. And Osama never stumbled over that. He wouldn't waste his time arguing. He just wanted the gadgets. He wanted to watch TV. And he began to innovate with those right away.
That's right. Did you feel at the end of your whole research journey, did you feel that in the end the differences between you and bin Laden turn out to be bigger or turn out to have been smaller?
Well, a little bit of both, because in many ways he comes to you through his family, because his family connects him to global culture, I think, accurately. I mean, it's just that's the way it always was. We really just maybe didn't spend as much time understanding it or seeing it. But in another way, he's a frustrating subject, because I've read everything he's ever said or written. And this is not his strength, his formulation of argument and his thinking through of his own narrative of war and so forth. And one of the characteristics of this is that he often tacks back and forth between very familiar political speech, where he sounds like a commentator on Al Jazeera complaining, ripped from today's headlines. You know, I have my comment now about the Israeli-Lebanon war. I have my comment about recent events in Europe, or the Pope's travels and so forth. So he's always commenting about news events that he's clearly consuming even now from his exile. But at the same time, he will suddenly shift, without even a transition sentence, into his millenarian vision, in which he clearly sees himself as called by God to fight a war against unbelievers until the preordained end of time, at which judgment will be passed. And really, in the end, all of this political commentary is subordinate to this millenarian narrative, in which the only outcome is worldwide conversion or death and fire. And you know, the
none
thing is
of them
that
very appealing.
Yes, and he seems to believe both quite passionately, that he has a role in the sort of political commentariat, but also that he is leading his followers to a judgment day that is beyond his authorship, and which is one reason why he's not so ambitious. He's really an instrument of this millenarian narrative. So.
Olivier Roy, the French, the Middle East expert, he recently wrote he said that the trouble with the American government is that they have misread Al-Qaeda. They think that terrorism for them is the same as what terrorism is for the Palestinians. But for the Palestinians, terrorism is a means to an end, which is a state. For Al-Qaeda, it's the end itself. And so by conflating them into one war on terror, you end up fighting the Palestinians, for whom it's something completely different.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And it's not just the Palestinians, but there are many other Islamist-informed insurgent groups that, while they may have millenarian ideas, and certainly there are elements of Hamas that do, and nonetheless, they are tied to territory. They're battling for territory, and they're seeking ultimately to govern territory that has been defined in the Westphalian system. And that makes them susceptible to all sorts of approaches that just don't work with Al-Qaeda, because Osama is not interested in territory in the way that you or I would recognize. He's perhaps interested, though he's a bit vague about this, in the revival of the most expansive Muslim territory of the early caliphate, but only because it fits into this narrative of that's going to hasten the final hour sort of thing, not because he wants to sit down and be governor of all he surveys.
That's right. So in the sense, both the left that's advocating negotiating with Al-Qaeda is wrong because there's nothing to negotiate with these people, and the right, who's advocating a war on terror, is wrong because they're conflating.
And they're aggregating. And also the other reason why the war on terror construction is flawed is not just that it conflates these completely distinctive problems and grievances, and by doing so makes it more difficult to achieve particular progress, but also it provides Osama the very narrative that he seeks. I mean, he does, in his millenarian sense, see himself leading a global war. That's his narrative. And so to deliver it to him and to elevate him that way is is an unnecessary error.
That has been incredibly clever. He's also this wealth thing that he's been playing the Robin Hood card. And we fell for it because no one went to these L.A. courthouse files.
Yes. If we could go into his annual budget meeting, each year, and look at his little sort of pie chart, I think he'd look like a lot of nonprofit charitable organizations. He's got a little bit in the bank. He's got a lot left to raise, and he's got to get his people out there and raising money.
All right. Did you? You traveled a lot to Saudi Arabia. Did you at some point feel more, maybe not sympathy, but more empathy for the sort of general Islamist point of view?
Well, it's difficult because the Saudi political economy is so broken, in my estimation. There's so little oxygen for the sort of ordinary political discourse that would be the analog to the rather ordinary and humanizing diversity of cultural choice that's visible in a family like the bin Laden. So you can try to create a little breathing room culturally if you are discreet and you carry some of yourself abroad and then put it on the shelf, leave it there, and come home. You can manage that way, but politically you don't have even that much space. So the Islamists in Saudi Arabia are the only legitimate source of politics. And so, yes, you can empathize with them because they express an obvious set of dissents. This system doesn't work. This system is not fair. This system needs to change on behalf of a lot of people who share their vernacular of political Islam, and on behalf of a lot of people who don't and wouldn't want to be governed by them but want some space to find their own politics.
And on the cultural side of things, the way you describe Saudi Arabia as this country that's really basically bombarded with sudden wealth. They have no diaspora that can help them spend all that wealth. Every Westerner they meet is out there for their cash. The things about alcohol addiction in the Saudi royal family, people are so obese that they can no longer get to the toilet. Toilet. I'm noticing now too. The corruption, the gambling, the hypocrisy. That at some point, when you're confronted with all these things, you would want for some sort of purity to compensate for all that.
Well, exactly, and the poison in the system is that the space for an ordinary, balanced life, one that is Arabian in its embrace of faith and family and place, which includes Mecca and Medina, and the stewardship, the unique stewardship of those places in the Islamic community and so forth. To have that, but not to attempt to imitate the precise habits of dress and prayer of the 7th century. The struggle to do that, to be able to watch television and follow European soccer teams and also be a faithful Saudi Arabian and a patriot and a Muslim, that's the space that is so pinched in Saudi Arabia. That's the hardest to find because it's always being encroached upon by both sides, the sort of the excess and the temptations and the unexplored freedom of the West, and the Islamists with their program for every waking minute that you have. And many of the bin Ladens have actually used their wealth to carve out that sort of center and live in it. But it is it's a treacherous and difficult thing to do, especially if you don't have money.
Yeah, more and more. Well, what in the end surprised you most?
I knew that there was diversity in the bin Laden family. I was counting on that to make my narrative work, that there would be contrasts and so forth. But Salam was a surprise, I have to say. I mean, he was, from a researcher's point of view and a writer's point of view, he was the gift that kept on giving and never stopped. And so I'm grateful that he walked this earth. And I have to say, many of his friends cooperated with me because they really loved him, and he really was someone who had changed their own young lives, usually when they were young, and they wanted him to be remembered. He did not leave behind people full of grievance, people full of dispute, people full of anger. Even the most fraught of his relationships with complicated girlfriend relationships and so forth are now all seen in a very affectionate nostalgia by those who knew him. And this, you can imagine for them how distorting 9/11 was, because their experience of the bin Ladens was mostly dominated by Salam's personality. And suddenly they didn't quite know where to put that. So when somebody comes around knocking on the door at 9 a.m, actually everyone was really ready to remember him in all of his fullness. So for that I was very grateful.
Before we give the floor the chance to participate, two more questions. One, psychology is not really your... you're looking at me.
I'm up for psychological speculation. Go ahead.
Let's do some psychological. Is it Oedipal?
Sorry? Oedipal.
Oedipal.
Yeah. I actually think that a sort of Freudian or neo-Freudian framework is a useful thing to lay down on Osama and just look at it. And I don't think you can do much more than that, because he's not available to think out loud and tell us what comes to mind, as they say. But I think what really strikes me, and his family speculate about this too. I mean, they speculate about what it was like to deal with the loss of a father, the push of his mother, and then a stepfather, death of his father. Certainly there are a series of mentor relationships there that are suggestive or interesting to observe. But I think the thing that I would feel most confident in really speculating about is what an extraordinarily pressured and special child he must have felt to be in that household, and how alone he was in his status. Because his mother is very young, and you can imagine they're very close to one another. There's a lot of descriptions of his high school friends, of them just being in one another's embrace all the time, lying, caressing each other. And you can imagine her as this teen bride with this child, clinging to this child. And even if she was a confident, relatively worldly Syrian 17-year-old sent away from home to marry an old man, still she would have had some anxiety as she embarked on this second household with this child who is the source of her security, everything, her identity, her wealth, the stability of her new household, the stability of her new family. And here he is in this environment, being caressed but also being isolated. And who knows what effect that had on him. He's quite silent about it all. But this sense of entitlement and also frustration is clearly present in his life as an adult. And I think probably some of that, runs in that direction.
Because we like to laugh at people who are waiting for the end of times and those things. But in the end, it's deeply sad that someone loses all confidence in life and begins to hope for the end of it all.
Yes, yeah. Well, but he also is comfortable enough in the life that he has to feel genuinely ambivalent about the loss of that life. So, for instance, in December of 2001, when he thinks he's going to die, he thinks he's about to be caught or killed, he says to his sons, even those he's raised in jihad, he basically writes them a letter saying, don't live this life. I officially, instruct you or give you permission to go have another life. One life of this kind is enough for the bin Ladens. And so there's this kind of a wistfulness and a sense of regret that's present, not just then, but earlier, where he's clearly thinking about having it all or giving up the exile and the inevitable march to the end of his own time. But at each point, something spurs him onward. Of course, his followers would say that he's called, but I think from our perspective, we would say that there is something spurring him besides ambition, because it's not... he truly believes what he believes, and he really does want to change the world in that way. But there is also, you can hear in his own descriptions of it, something very personal about this decision to keep moving towards the edge of the earth, as it were.
If you had one question you could put to him, and he could answer in full off the record, but you could still use it in some...
This is a journalist. Okay, it's off the record, but I still think I get the benefit of using it. Yeah, that's the way that would be the best ground rules. I just want to hear him talk about his brothers and his break with his family, because he's so remarkably silent about this. And yet, if you read him closely, his texts, his pamphlets, his dissents, his poetry, I mean, you don't have to work very hard. It's there. He had some kind of struggle for leadership after he came back from Afghanistan in 1989, and it sent him into this exile that ultimately led him to this declaration of war. And it's not the only factor in his motivation, obviously, but it's there, and it's completely subdued. And I know he's got a great story he wants to tell about what a jerk his big brother is. I'd love to hear all about it someday. Yeah.
Who knows? Well, we'll send him the request. Yeah. There's now room for the floor. 2 ground rules. One is that if you begin your question by saying, I don't have a question but a comment, you lose. No comments. Post it to the internet. Second, a question is short. All right. There are 2 microphones, and there's the first Chinese volunteer.
Good evening. My name's Andrew Harland. A question. How would you stop him?
How would I?
How to stop him.
How to stop him. Well, I don't think he or his organization or the movement that it has generated can be easily stopped, but I think it can be contained, and I think the first thing to do is to change the narrative in which this recruitment and attacking occurs by depriving Al-Qaeda of the narrative of total global war that it now thrives upon. There's lots of practical steps that you could also take. But it's important to understand that while at 9/11 and immediately afterwards Osama bin Laden was a genuinely folk hero-style figure for many in the Arab world, even those who were horrified by the suffering that he created on 9/11, nonetheless, he had a kind of folk heroic aura about him because of his ability to, in the view of many in the Arab world, punish the United States after many decades of impunity. And yet, as his campaign has unfolded since then, he's created many more Muslim victims than Western ones, and the sense of disillusionment or recognition about him is now forming in many, many places where it had earlier not formed. And so ultimately he'll be contained by the Islamic community from which he is a deviant. And it ought to be the role of the West not only to protect its own obvious interests and the lives of its citizens, but also to try to construct policies that make it possible for his natural adversaries in the Islamic world to prevail over him and his kind.
Which does prompt the question what those policies would be then.
Well, they wouldn't be the policies of the current American administration, I think, would be part of the way to go. I mean, I think, for the United States, it's starting from a position of such a difficulty, frankly, that all of the pragmatic problems of the next administration are really prelude to this ambition, because they really involve the unwinding of Iraq and the context of Iraq and its ancillary problems in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and in Pakistan and in other places and in Afghanistan. And so the construction of sustainable coalition global policies that back off from this or start to find a way out of this hole, that's going to, I'm afraid, overwhelm the first term of the next administration. So this broader ambition, this vision, I think is important to have in mind because it helps you weigh practical choices. But it is not the case that you can start from a fresh line here, not for the United States, and for Europe I don't pretend to know the answer.
I'm also a journalist, and as such, I'm very curious to know, A, how you managed to get access to all these people, and B, how you were able to check that what they told you was actually true.
Could everybody hear this? All right.
Well, the access was, I worked from three principal sources. First, historical archives, which proved to be very fruitful for the life of his father. It turned out, I went to Saudi Arabia first and stayed at a think tank to try to work in Saudi archives about the life of the father, figuring that would be the least controversial question I could arrive in the kingdom with. They knew I was writing about the bin Ladens. I told them that. I didn't think it was profitable to try to fake them out. So I told them I'm writing a book about the bin Ladens, and they took a long, oh, excellent, great. But they were kind enough to welcome me in, and so I thought I would do the father and say, well, look, we all agree the father is interesting, and nobody can blame him for any of this. But it turned out that the archives and the records there were considerably thinner than I had hoped, and I came away thinking I really had wanted to write him at some scale, and I was frustrated. But a friend of mine said, well, go to the American diplomatic archives, look at every piece of paper that was sent out of the embassy in Jeddah from 1945 to 1967, and I'll bet you'll be amazed. And it took 2 or 3 months to do that, but I was amazed. And then I went to Britain, then I went to Germany and Israel, other places. So the father's life was in the record, essentially. There was some interviewing to supplement. Salam's life was in 2 places. It was in American court and business records, which turned out to be a great backstop of authentic documentary evidence. Because, you find in interviewing that you need some contemporaneous, reliable document to at least anchor people's recollections, to compare people's recollections to. And while obviously there weren't a lot of documents about his hemorrhoid filming and so forth, there were nonetheless in American courts, scattered in all the different places where bin Ladens had lived and done business, really rich civil records. I think the book has a list of all the different cases that I came across involving bin Ladens, and none of these had ever been examined before. And when you really went through them carefully and laid down all that they showed, you had a pretty good baseline that you could rely upon in court documents. And then finally I did a lot of interviewing, and I would bounce from the documents to people. I'd see somebody who had filed a suit against so-and-so and then find them and then interview them, and they'd send me to someone else. And eventually I got into Salam's world. I can't vouch that every recollection that was provided to me, is correctly recalled. I can only insist that people who offer such recollections attach their names to them, as often as possible. And I think there's quite a lot of on-the-record interviewing in the book about virtually all of the vivid things that I've tried to describe tonight.
Was there, a journalist's question, something really good, but which turned out to be a darling that had to be killed?
Yeah, there was. I don't. Well, this is kind of a cynical, but you'll have to forgive us because we're journalists trading reporter stories. But I loved working in these courthouses, and I kept having these eureka moments. Oh my God, you wouldn't believe this! And of course, nobody was around to hear any of this. I was often, all these sullen people getting their court files for their divorces or various things, and there's some reporter going, "Oh my God, you wouldn't believe this!" But there was a really sad case involving a section of the bin Laden family involving one woman who became addicted to drugs, and just her life fell apart. But it was right in the center of the family, and the family was kind of enabling her and so forth. And I thought that it was such a stark, that Americans would recognize this as such a familiar narrative of kind of loss of control and drug addiction and just the full pathos of that right in the heart of the bin Laden family. And at first I thought this is going to be very powerful. But when it came to writing it, I just couldn't make it work. It just felt exploitive, and so I finally backed off of it and just have a passing sentence about it. But it's a very rich narrative, and I came home to all my friends. I was very excited and said, I'm going to be able to write the words crack and bin Laden in the same sentence. But in the end, I really couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to do it.
It's interesting, these addictions structure one's life, and so does religion. So in the way that perhaps Osama bin Laden was addicted, but not to drugs, but to religion.
Yeah, although in Saudi Arabia, it's like being addicted to gambling in Las Vegas. I mean, it's an entirely orthodox passion, and I think the difference in his case was that, there are many very fully devoted Islamic lives on display in Saudi Arabia, but not very many of them take the risk of involving themselves in politics. And it was the particular recruitment of Osama into the Muslim Brotherhood by his charismatic Syrian gym teacher in prep school that delivered to him at the very earliest age, 13, 14, a particularly political interpretation of his duty as a fully devoted Muslim. And that connection to the anti-colonial Islamism of the Brotherhood, I think, is absolutely crucial, because much of the orthodoxy and Puritanism in Saudi Arabia, while radical from our point of view in cultural terms, is deliberately stripped of political content by the Saudi royal family. And so there are many of Osama's sympathizers who never started in such an openly activist and political way as he did.
Yeah, please write. Oh, there's two.
You're
next.
Both. Room for both.
I have three questions. Tell us something about the stepfather. And the second is the grievance against Israel. Was it just the house in Jerusalem, or was there a real rage or feeling that the war between the Palestinians and the Israelis provided a motive for what he did? And the third is, tell us about the Bin Ladens and the Bushes. That story that you heard about them being in conclave with some Bush representatives on 9/11 being flown out of the country is something, of course, is very fascinating to hear, and I'd like to hear from you whether it's true.
Yeah. The stepfather, there are only so many available accounts here. I was interviewed by an Osama specialist in the United States just before I came over here for an hour, and I think it would have been very boring to listen to because it was two Osama nerds talking at a footnote level. But one thing that we agreed upon is that the testimony about questions like the stepfather it's both credible and multiple, but it's not as rich as you would wish it to be. I mean, you really, there's the same 3 or 4 or 5 accounts that give you, and you don't really have much direct access. But with that caveat, he's by all accounts a very gentle, stable, passive person, not a large personality, was a lower to middle level official at the company, and was seen as being very sweet-tempered and very gentle, certainly not rough or aggressive or anyone who tried to substitute for Osama's father as an inspiration in his life, certainly didn't seem to be a model for ambition or aggression in any way. This grievance against Israel. I mean, from 1984 or 5 onward, Osama was surrounded continuously by Egyptians and also Palestinians who were exiles from and veterans of that conflict. And so he never really had a credible personal involvement in it, but I think he absorbed their narrative and then had his own to add, his own source of credibility, which was, you can see him, and he talks about it from time to time. Again, the record is thinner than you'd wish, but you can imagine him from the record that is available sitting around the campfire with his war storytelling Palestinian comrades saying, "Oh, did I ever tell you my father?" That's his claim to the narrative. So I think that he's absorbing and channeling their narrative of grievance, but then he has his own claim because he knows that is a source of enormous credibility and importance among his following in the Arab world. And then
your president and the terrorist.
My president and the terrorist. Well, I want to leave some reason for you to read and buy the book. It's a complicated story. some of what Michael Moore says is true and some of it is exaggerated. The sources of interest are maybe a little more complicated and have more to do with a certain way of being in Texas at a certain time than necessarily some grand conspiracy. But it's a very interesting subject that I try to treat as fully as my reporting allowed, and I'll leave you to read it. I thought my publisher would appreciate that.
My name is Joop Haselberg. I have two questions. The first is, could you elaborate a bit on the political situation in Saudi Arabia at this point in time? And the second is, I'm going to Gaza next week, and I wonder what happens if I drop the name Osama bin Laden there.
What happens if he does what in Gaza?
If I drop the name
Osama bin Laden in Gaza. Well, on the first question, the political situation in Saudi Arabia, I think it's very stable, really, and it turns out $100 a barrel oil will buy you pretty much the best police informer network in the Gulf, and as Al-Qaeda essentially declared war on the Saudi government in 2003, and it proved that they were not really ready for that conflict, and they also ended up just getting the attention of the Saudi government finally in a serious way, and the Saudis have since gradually rolled them up pretty badly, and they don't really seem to have succeeded in calling into question the legitimacy of the rule of the Al Saud or even destabilizing the political economy of Saudi Arabia. Instead, they've just stimulated a great round of spending on prisons and listening devices and neighborhood informers. And so I see Saudi Arabia as really quite stable these days, probably more stable than it's been since the 70s.
The prisons are then built by the Mohammed bin Laden group?
They are, yeah. They want a big prison building contract.
It's a scheme. I don't know why nobody
They also, by the way, they owned a privatized prison in the United States, in Massachusetts, although it was a sort of minimum security women's prison, but they owned it when the state of Massachusetts started selling off prisons to private business. Anyway, Gaza, I'd be interested to know, actually, I don't want to officially encourage you to throw the name of Osama bin Laden around in Gaza, but I'd be interested to know what impressions you or others who travel in especially radical leadership circles in Gaza hear, because the general impression is that in the refugee camps in Lebanon in particular, Al-Qaeda has finally built a few beginning networks, or at least of like-minded Palestinian organizers, and who are playing off the brand and the cool and you saw that in that campaign when the Lebanese went into those camps and tried to knock them around a little bit. But you would have to assume that whatever there is that survived that and whatever has mutated out of that has kind of run its way into Gaza. But whether Hamas wants anything to do with it other than to kind of put it on reserve or use it as shock troops, I don't hear or read a lot of credible, specific reporting about that, and it's an interesting subject.
There has been a lot of debate about what should have been done differently post 9/11 to prevent escalation. I wonder, with the insights from your book, what should have been done differently before 9/11 to prevent escalation as it is now?
Can you...
what could have been done not so much after 9/11? We should
before,
not have framed it as...
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's another book you can buy called Ghost Wars. That's basically a very elaborate answer to that question. But there's so many layers of missed opportunity in the run-up to 9/11, and of course, it's not only the narrative of American policy that is the only way to see 9/11, but it's a way and an important way to see 9/11 and its antecedents. And the whole narrative of Ghost Wars is an attempt to try to locate the antecedents of 9/11 in American foreign and intelligence policy over 2 decades. I would just pick one theme out of that to give you a more specific answer, which is the Clinton administration between 1997 and 2000 attempted to locate and kill bin Laden with a cruise missile. They stationed submarines off the coast of Pakistan equipped with cruise missiles, and they hired Afghan agents run by the CIA to try to locate him so that these missiles could be fired in. They rehearsed it 3 hours from presidential decision to missile arrival time. But they failed in part because they could never get intelligence that the president and his advisors judged was sure enough to warrant a missile strike. But they failed much more broadly than that. For a long while, the United States, and it wasn't just the Clinton presidency, it was also the Congress, and for that matter, the media, and for that matter, America's allies, they really didn't see the Afghan context in which al-Qaeda and the Taliban had blossomed and had come to pose a legitimate threat to the lives and security and economic well-being of the West. There was an attempt to sort of solve this with a pinprick, a single bullet. If we could only find him and just hit him with a missile. But al-Qaeda existed in Afghanistan because Afghanistan had failed, and there was no appetite to deal with its humanitarian crises, its famines, its 20 years of civil war, or with the Taliban, who were, we now, I think, understand, a profoundly unpopular imposition on Afghan national culture and tradition and potential, and could easily have been addressed with a more realistic policy. So I think in the U.S. there was always a way in which 9/11 was judged as a failure of intelligence policy, of intelligence operations, and it was a failure of intelligence. But it was also a failure of foreign policy, and I think even more profoundly, it was a failure of foreign policy.
How about, since this is the John Adams Institute, it would be interesting to ask you a question as an American, is that your country gives the world IBM, it gives the world Google, Microsoft. Now, at some areas, the Americans are extremely good. Then, when it comes to understanding the Arab world, it's pathetic.
Not so good.
But it's mine, and I think part of all these conspiracy theories deal with the fact that we just cannot believe that on the one hand you can be so good, and then on the other hand, you seem to make such obvious mistakes. The U.S. government. And so, why is that?
Well, I think it's hard. There are lots of reasons. America's historical isolation from the rest of the world, its culture has largely been indifferent to the rest of the world. Very much a national tradition of isolationism that John Adams, for one, sought to break. But a more specific reason in the last 20 years was the sort of stagnation of the national security bureaucracy in the late Cold War, and then its shrinking and demoralization after the Cold War. At the very moment when America needed a broadly based strategy and a broadly distributed set of eyes and engagements in the world, its apparatus for even delivering some of that was seizing up and freezing up and shrinking. And really, since 9/11, though the administration, the elected cabinet of the United States has made a whole series of, in my judgment, unconscionable mistakes, actually the bureaucracy has been infused with a new generation of young people who came into government after 9/11. For the first time, we actually have a lot of talent. They're all in their 20s, and they're assistants to somebody who is still operating from, in many cases, old habits of mind. But there is, I think, in the metaphor of the Obama campaign, a real appetite among the generation that is now in their 20s to take this for themselves. And I say, my own daughter was working on the Obama campaign, and so I watched her, and her generation in a very sort of close-up way, and it's very powerful. And we were talking about this at dinner. I say to my friends, my kind of baby boomer friends, look at the statistics coming out of the exit polls, even in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, very troubled states, if anything, the isolationist heart. From ages 18 to 24, the split is 75-25. From 24 to 35, it's 69-31. I say to my friends, we got to get out of the way. These people have someplace they want to go, and I think that in the end, that is the only way that the bureaucracy and the rest of the system will start to move in a more sustainable direction.
We have time for one last question, and the hand has risen. You are the winner.
Thank you. You obviously know very much about the subject. You're an expert, and your advice sounds very reasonable and good. Don't you think that looking toward the future, with a new president coming in, from my point of view, hopefully a Democrat, that with some public spirit, a person such as yourself might have a future in the new administration?
A personal ambition question.
Well, I never say never about anything, but my contribution is such as it is to do this. I mean, there's an enormous opportunity and freedom and privilege to be able to travel unfettered. When I travel in Pakistan and the Middle East to try to put together something like this so that I can come and talk about it and communicate about it, I enjoy such, as you know, such incredible privilege to talk to whomever I want. It's not that dangerous if you use common sense and you take care.
No, they're just not calling back if you're Dutch.
I look at of course I see the official Americans when I'm on the road, and it's so hard because everybody's in a bubble these days, and it's really all about force protection and all about being inside. And I think, in any event, whatever comes in D.C. or for myself, this role of being the independent traveler and writer and communicator is, I think, in some ways a much more efficient way to contribute than to be swallowed up by the bureaucracy.
Right, which is a hopeful last note, because it means that we may
There's
have another
future
book.
Of journalism.
Yeah, right. Don't get dragged into politics. Give us more of those books. Steve Coll, I think it's superhuman what authors like you do these days. I think it's called "This is Tuesday, so this must be Belgium." Every day, 9-10 interview meetings, and then in the evening get grilled in old churches by people with funny accents. I want to thank you. I want to thank you wholeheartedly for your time, your energy, and I think not a single person will leave this church not having been enriched by all your ideas and insights. And so do buy the book, and not only this one, but also the other one, Ghost Wars, and you're set for the whole summer. Thank you very much.
I had some closing remarks, but Joris did that so beautifully that I don't think I have to deliver them. I would just like to thank Steve Coll and Joris Luijendijk for a truly stimulating conversation. And thanks to Moria, Steve's Dutch publisher, and Penguin, Steve's English language publisher, and the Posthoornkerk, the deconsecrated, I guess, church in which we are sitting. Once again, this Saturday, John Adams events featuring Juno Diaz, Ben Kachor, and Julie Phillips. And upcoming on May 13th, we have Michael Oreskes, the editor of the International Herald Tribune, in a conversation with Twan House about the American presidential election. Thank you all very much for coming.